I want to ask you if you recognize this just painfully relatable scenario. It's the night before something important, maybe a high-stakes meeting or, just a particularly demanding Tuesday.
Oh, yeah. We've all been there with that kind of dread.
Exactly. So you are lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, absolutely stressing over every tiny detail of what might go wrong tomorrow. So out of sheer anxiety, you set like a dozen alarms, 6 a.m., 6:05, 6:10, just in case.
Right. It's basically the classic insurance policy we take out against our own internal exhaustion. I mean, we don't trust our bodies to actually function naturally, so we try to engineer this foolproof system.
Yes, but then, the morning actually arrives, and you wake up early before the first alarm even goes off. You look at the clock, realize you still have this 15-minute buffer, and decide, well, I can squeeze in just a little more sleep.
And then the trap snaps shut.
It really does, because then, ironically, tragically, you end up sleeping right through all those alarms and waking up late anyway.
Yeah, it's a completely self-fulfilling prophecy, and it perfectly encapsulates this cycle of chronic psychological anxiety we're talking about today. You spend so much energy worrying about a potential failure that you completely drain the very reserves you need to actually succeed.
Which is exactly what today's deep dive is all about. We're taking a close look at the roots of this phenomenon. We're exploring chronic psychological anxiety and that deep, bone-weary internal exhaustion, that very specific feeling of being completely trapped in your own head, endlessly agonizing over things that haven't even happened yet.
I want to say right up front, if you were listening to this and you constantly feel rushed or panicked, even by something as completely mundane as a knock at the front door, you are not alone. And more importantly, this is not a character flaw.
That's such a relief to hear, honestly.
It really is. It's a deeply ingrained, learned physiological reflex. Your nervous system is basically misinterpreting the modern world. But the good news about learned reflexes is that they can absolutely be unlearned.
So our mission for this deep dive is to map out the architecture of this exhaustion. We are going to break down exactly why our brains turn everyday chores into these high-stakes emergencies, how this all links back to our childhood, and finally, look at the practical steps to rewire this response. So let's start with how this actually manifests in our daily lives. Think about what we can call the package pickup panic.
Oh, this is such a great example. So you are sitting in your living room expecting a package. The courier knocks on the door. Now, a regulated nervous system would hear that knock, register that a delivery has arrived, and, calmly walk to the front door.
It's no normal stroll to the door.
Right. But for someone dealing with chronic internal exhaustion, that knock triggers an immediate, massive physiological spike. Your heart rate accelerates instantly.
You suddenly feel this overwhelming urgency, like you absolutely cannot keep this courier waiting for even a single second. So you start scrambling around, you're tripping over your own shoes, apologizing profusely to a complete stranger simply because they had to stand on your porch for like an extra 10 seconds. You feel completely awkward and rushed in your own home over a cardboard box.
Exactly. And the disproportionate nature of the response is the key indicator here. The stimulus is tiny. It's just a delivery. But the internal reaction is massive. You are treating another person's incredibly mild inconvenience as an absolute existential emergency that you have to prevent at all costs.
It's wild when you step back and look at it.
It is. You are modulating your entire physical state just to manage a stranger's hypothetical annoyance.
And it scales up, right? It's not just the doorbells. Think about what we can call the big task loop. This is where the internal exhaustion becomes truly debilitating.
Oh, the big task paralysis. Yeah.
It's that agonizing mix of constant anxiety and total procrastination. You stare at a mountain of unfinished work, like a massive project, a messy inbox, or a disorganized house, and you feel this wave of intense dread. You tell yourself, I can't truly relax until every single piece of this is done. But your body simply refuses to move.
What's happening there is you are experiencing a literal tug of war within your autonomic nervous system. On one side, you have hyperarousal. The sympathetic nervous system is just screaming at you, flooding your bloodstream with cortisol and adrenaline.
Telling you that this task is a threat and you must address it immediately.
Exactly. That's the anxiety part, the total inability to relax.
But at the exact same time, you have the procrastination, the paralysis.
Right. Because the perceived threat is so overwhelming, the parasympathetic nervous system kicks in with what's known as a dorsal vagal response, hypoarousal, the freeze response. Your biology essentially decides that the threat is too big to fight and too big to run from, so it just shuts the system down to conserve energy. You are stuck oscillating rapidly between pure panic and total paralysis.
And I mean, we try to brush this off, right? We claim to ourselves or others, oh, I'm just a meticulous planner, or I'm just a really impatient person. But functionally, it's like sitting in a car with the parking brake securely engaged while simultaneously flooring the gas pedal.
That's a perfect analogy.
You're burning through all your mental fuel, you're creating massive internal friction, but the transmission isn't engaged. You aren't actually moving forward an inch.
And the wear and tear on the engine from doing that is immense. You end the day feeling like you've run a marathon, but when you look at your to-do list, you haven't crossed off a single item.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here for a second, though.
Go for it.
If this is just a physiological reflex, like a fundamental hardware issue with our nervous system, why is it so selective?
What do you mean?
Like, why am I completely paralyzed by drafting a basic work email or calling a customer service rep, but I'm totally fine planning a complex multi-day vacation or, executing a highly stressful strategy in a competitive video game?
Yeah.
If my body defaults to the freeze response under pressure, why doesn't it apply to everything?
That is the crucial distinction. The freeze response isn't triggered by the complexity of the task itself or the sheer effort required. It is triggered by the potential for evaluation, judgment, and social failure.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you aren't reacting to the work itself. You're reacting to a deeply stored neurological memory of what happens when your work is judged to be imperfect. To really understand why your body treats an email draft as a lethal threat, we have to look back at childhood brain development.
Okay, let's trace this back to elementary school then. Think about the feeling of forgetting a piece of your school uniform, like a tie or a specific pair of shoes. To an adult, forgetting a uniform piece is a minor administrative issue.
Barely a blip on the radar.
Right. But as a child, it feels like the fabric of reality is tearing apart.
Or recall that visceral memory of sitting in a classroom while the teacher walks down the row, checking to see if everyone completed their math worksheet. You reach into your backpack and realize yours is sitting on your kitchen table.
Oh, just thinking about it makes my stomach completely drop. Your heart pounds and your body goes entirely rigid. You sit there terrified of the moment the teacher arrives at your desk, and your internal monologue just loops the word stupid over and over.
And as adults, we rationally know that forgetting a math worksheet didn't end anyone's life. But we have to view this through the lens of evolutionary biology. For a human child, the approval of the adults around them, parents, teachers, caregivers, isn't just a nice psychological boost.
It's their literal survival mechanism.
Exactly. A child cannot feed, shelter, or protect themselves. Their safety depends entirely on remaining in the good graces of the dweeb.
So when a child experiences harsh criticism for a tiny slip-up, when they are publicly shamed or ask questions like, how could you be so careless? Or why can't you just get this simple thing right? The brain doesn't process that as a simple correction.
It processes it as relational severance. The child's amygdala, which is the brain's threat detection center, registers the disapproval of the caregiver as a signal that they might be abandoned. And to a child's brain, abandonment equals death.
Wow, that is heavy.
It is. So the nervous system learns a profound, enduring lesson from that. It wires the concept of making a mistake directly to the biological fear of existential threat.
Meaning we are essentially walking around with a fundamentally miscalibrated smoke detector. Our nervous system takes the memory of a forgotten homework assignment from 20 years ago, projects it onto a delayed courier or an unread email today, and sets off a 5-alarm fire bell.
Yeah, the smoke detector is highly calibrated to detect even the faintest whiff of disapproval. And because those things felt like life or death threats to your developing brain, the alarm that sounds today is deafening. The reflex to fear making a mistake just becomes hardwired into your baseline operating state.
So how does that childhood need for external praise evolve into the internal exhaustion we feel today? Because it seems like it fundamentally disrupts our ability to self-regulate.
It absolutely does. When a child is raised in an environment where mistakes are treated as catastrophic, they never develop an internal sense of security. They never internalize that belief that says, I am a capable person and I will be perfectly fine even if I mess up.
Right, because without that internal anchor, you become completely dependent on external validation just to feel safe.
Exactly. So you start over-rehearsing every single detail of your life. You script out conversations before they happen. You obsessively check and recheck your work to predict every possible outcome and preempt every potential criticism.
But that external validation is a moving target, isn't it? You can never get enough of it to truly quiet the alarm, which really explains why this defense mechanism completely collapses when we enter high-pressure adult environments, like a demanding corporate job or trying to manage a household.
Yes, the system just gets overwhelmed.
We often describe perfectionism as a suit of armor we wear to protect ourselves from the world. But armor implies something passive. To me, it functions much more like an overzealous antivirus software program running in the background of a computer.
Oh, I like that. Walk us through that analogy.
So you install this perfectionism software to protect your system from the virus of criticism or failure, right? But the software is poorly coded. It's way too aggressive. It starts scanning every single process. Every email draft, every text message, every minor decision is subjected to a deep, exhaustive scan for potential threats.
And eventually, that background process consumes, 99% of your mental RAM?
Exactly. The computer doesn't crash because the actual work is too hard. It crashes because the defense mechanism itself is hogging all the processing power.
The operating system grinds to an absolute halt. And that translates into profound physical symptoms in real life. When your nervous system is trapped in that hypervigilant scanning mode, it sustains a continuous drip of stress hormones. Over time, that saturation leads to chronic inflammation, muscle tension, and even severe digestive issues.
So we aren't just talking about feeling stressed in the colloquial sense here. We are talking about waking up with nausea, experiencing random heart palpitations at your desk, your hands literally shaking before a presentation.
Because your body cannot differentiate between a physical predator in the room and the emotional threat of sending a slightly flawed report to your boss. It prepares your body for physical combat to fight an email.
It's so exhausting, and people often try to justify this internal exhaustion. They say, well, I just have very high standards. I care about my work. And hey, having high standards is great. Aspiring to excellence is a positive trait. But when the pursuit of those standards crosses the line from intrinsic motivation to biological terror, it ceases to be about the work at all.
It ceases to be productive and becomes entirely destructive. High standards are meant to elevate your performance. When they are driven by this childhood trauma response, they just paralyze your performance. The standards just become a weapon you are constantly holding to your own head.
Which is exactly why you end up staring at that mountain of work we talked about earlier, feeling intense dread and completely unable to move. The overzealous antivirus software has frozen the system.
Right.
So the critical question becomes, how do we force quit the program? How do we actually convince our nervous system that we are safe in the present moment and that making a mistake will not result in our destruction?
Well, knowing the origin of the reflex is really only half the battle. Rewiring a deeply entrenched neural pathway requires a two-pronged approach. It requires a cognitive shift and, more importantly, a behavioral shift.
Okay, let's start with the cognitive side. It requires a fundamental redefinition of failure, right?
Yes. You have to slowly start to allow yourself to make mistakes. You have to decouple the concept of making an error from the concept of being in danger. When you were 7 years old, an error might have resulted in harsh relational punishment that threatened your sense of survival.
But today, as an autonomous adult, keeping a courier waiting for 15 seconds or putting a typo in a slide deck does not threaten your actual physical survival.
Exactly. You have to deeply internalize that being less than perfect does not equal failure, and failure does not equal death. But as we know, you cannot simply outthink an overthinking problem.
Right. You can't just logically convince a panicked amygdala to calm down. It doesn't speak logic.
Exactly. Anxiety lives entirely in the realm of a hypothetical future. It thrives in the prefrontal cortex, just spinning out endless simulations. What if they judge me? What if I fail? What if I'm not good enough?
It's an infinite loop of what ifs.
And the only way to break an endless mental loop is to aggressively ground yourself in physical reality. You have to stop draining your energy through overthinking and pivot to action. Thinking only creates more variables. Acting creates concrete answers.
Acting creates answers. I love that. So this brings us to the practical applications. How do we translate acting creates answers into our daily routine? Let's go back to the package pickup panic. If you know a delivery is coming and you feel that physiological spike starting, how do you intervene?
You intervene by taking control of the physical environment before the hypothetical threat even arrives. If you're worried about making the courier wait, prep the outgoing box right now. Put it by the door. Tape it up.
Just eliminate the variable that is causing the panic by turning it into a completed physical task.
Right. You ground yourself in the present moment.
But what about the bigger challenges? Like when you are staring down that mountain of work, the inbox with 500 unread emails, and your nervous system has fully engaged the parking brake, how do you press the gas pedal then?
You don't try to climb the whole mountain. You use the 5-minute rule. You give yourself permission to do a remarkably tiny amount of work. You say, I am only going to open the document and type for 5 minutes. That's it. If I want to stop after 5 minutes, I absolutely can.
So you complete one extremely small step.
Yes. And then, and this is the most critical part of the process, you deliberately give yourself a small reward.
Let's explore the mechanism behind that reward, because that sounds important. Why is it so crucial to reward yourself for just 5 minutes of work? What is actually happening in the brain?
It's all about rewiring the dopamine pathways. We often think of dopamine as just the pleasure chemical, but functionally, it's the neuromodulator of motivation and learning. It's how the brain tags a behavior as beneficial.
Okay.
So when you complete that tiny 5-minute task and acknowledge it with a reward, even just a moment of saying out loud to yourself, good job, you started, your brain releases a microdose of dopamine.
And what does that dopamine do to the anxiety?
It actively suppresses it. Dopamine signals to the amygdala that the environment is safe and that the current behavior is yielding positive results. It essentially tells the nervous system to turn down the cortisol drip and disengage that dorsal vagal freeze response.
So you are teaching your biology a brand new sequence. The old sequence was action equals evaluation, evaluation equals criticism, criticism equals danger.
Exactly. And the new sequence is action equals completion, completion equals dopamine, dopamine equals safety.
It's like poking a tiny pinhole in a massive, overinflated balloon of anxiety. You don't have to pop the whole thing at once, because the thought of popping it is what paralyzes you in the first place.
Right, it's too overwhelming.
Just engaging in a 5-minute task lets enough pressure out of that balloon so the system can breathe, recalibrate, and realize there is no actual fire.
And it's important to set realistic expectations for this process, too. Neurological rewiring is not a weekend project. You have spent decades practicing the habit of anxiety, perfectionism, and internal exhaustion. Those neural pathways are incredibly thick and well-insulated.
So the new pathway, the habit of action, self-compassion, and realizing you are safe, is basically like a tiny dirt path in the woods. You have to walk it repeatedly to clear the brush.
You do. But the immediate payoff is that things do get a little bit better the exact moment you start moving. Movement is the antidote to the freeze response. The biological fog of anxiety begins to dissipate the second you transition from hypothetical thinking to physical doing.
Because action signals to the body that you are no longer trapped. You are exercising agency, and agency is the exact opposite of helplessness.
Perfectly said.
So, to bring this all together for you listening right now, your chronic overthinking, that agonizing procrastination, the feeling of being completely drained by the friction of your own mind, none of this is a permanent personality trait. It is an outdated childhood defense mechanism.
It's an aggressive background software program you installed to survive an environment that demanded perfection for the sake of safety.
But you aren't in that environment anymore. You are an adult, and you have the authority to uninstall the program. You can trade those exhausting mental loops for 5-minute microactions. You can begin to grant yourself the profound grace to be wonderfully, safely imperfect.
And if we connect this back to the ultimate goal of unlearning fear and proving to your nervous system that the world is a safe place, I want to leave you with a final idea to chew on today.
Let's hear it.
If your body is currently trapped in the false belief that making a mistake is inherently dangerous, what if you ran a controlled experiment? What if you intentionally made a tiny, completely harmless mistake today?
Ooh, a deliberate error to test the system. Give us an example of what that looks like in practice.
Purposefully draft a casual text message or email to a close friend, insert an obvious typo, and hit send without correcting it. Or, when you were driving home from the grocery store, intentionally take a slightly longer, incorrect route.
You trigger the smoke detector on purpose?
Exactly. You let the alarm beep, your heart might flutter for a second, but then you look around. You observe the physical reality. The friend replies to the text normally. You arrive home 2 minutes later than usual. The sky didn't fall. You weren't abandoned.
Wow.
Yeah, proving to your own nervous system in real time that the world absolutely does not end when you mess up might be the ultimate shortcut to feeling truly safe in your own mind again.
Test the hardware. Realize there is no fire. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the architecture of internal exhaustion. We really encourage you to take just one small, concrete step today, whether it's packing that outgoing box, setting a 5-minute timer for that looming project, or even intentionally sending that typo. Reclaim your processing power. Until next time.